Okay, so the first part of the lecture went over the sort of basics of the origins of the 20th century civil rights movement. What we're going to be doing now is going through the different phases. So looking at the people and the events and the tactics that were important in the movement. So let's move on down. Remember, World War II was very important, both because it caused urbanization, but then it also really led to some changed attitudes, both whites and blacks. The case that really is the culmination of about half a century of work for the NAACP was Brown versus Board of Education. The important thing about Brown is, well, first that it ended legalized segregation in the school systems, but more than that, it really galvanized grassroots activism. And the Brown decision really caused people at the time to believe now that they had an ally. The Supreme Court had decided in their favor, and they had overruled that horrible Plessy versus Ferguson case. So black people now believed that they had an arm of the government that was going to be willing to help them and was going to be willing to help them make some change. So this is really going to galvanize African Americans across the country. It particularly galvanizes African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama. And the women in Montgomery, Alabama had been angry about racial issues for some time. Montgomery, of course, was a segregated city as the capital of Alabama. And one of the things that was particularly irritating to a lot of African Americans involved the buses. Riding on the buses was segregated, so there were certain areas for blacks and for whites. The problem as well was that because a lot of the African Americans didn't have a lot of money for their own cars, many of them had to ride the buses for transportation. They were having to go across Montgomery into the white areas of town to work, especially the black women who were going to be nannies or cooks or cleaners, which tells you something about the job options available for African Americans at the time. So African American women were upset about segregation on the buses. They were forced really to ride them. They didn't have much of a choice about riding them because they had to be able to get to work. They were also facing a lot of problematic treatment on the buses. The bus drivers were rude. They were often threatening. They were violent. They would do things like you normally had to get in at the front of the bus. The bus would generally have two entrances, one in the front and one in the middle. You would have to get in the front of the bus and pay. Sometimes the bus drivers wouldn't let you walk down the aisle to where the African Americans were supposed to sit. They didn't want to disturb the white people. So they would make the black person pay, get off the bus, then walk all the way down to the middle entrance and get on. What African American women began complaining about was that the bus drivers would sometimes, after they paid and then got back off to go around, would drive off. So just take their money and go. So they were furious about that. But there was also, just generalized sort of bad treatment and racism on the buses. And women, again, who were the main riders of the buses, these black women, were the majority of riders, had become really increasingly angry and tired and humiliated by this policy. So they had been getting angry and had been wanting to do something about this bus system for some time. And a young woman decided to sit down and to not move when she was told to on one of the buses, and she was arrested. This young woman's name was Claudette Colvin. She was a high school student in Montgomery, and she had been learning about segregation in school and decided to take a stand, decided to do something about it. So she had gotten arrested. And initially, some in the black community were kind of excited. They thought that here they had someone that they could build a case around, they could be active around. The NAACP put a stop to that, however, when they found out that Claudette Colvin, again, a high school student, was pregnant. And they felt that she did not present a quote-unquote good enough image for African Americans to, present and be this test case. So Claudette Colvin kind of, did her activism and then sort of got spurned by others in the movement. Then we have Rosa Parks coming along. Rosa Parks was a seamstress in Montgomery, which was sort of a higher level kind of position for African American women, a more respected, sort of a respected kind of position. She had been active in the NAACP for some time. She was, the secretary for the local NAACP, and she too was very interested in doing something about the bus situation. One of the common myths that we have about Rosa Parks is that she did this, she sat down on the bus and got arrested. She was tired, her feet hurt, she just didn't want to get up. That kind of myth really minimizes what she did, because she knew very, very well what she was doing and what she was getting herself into. She and her husband talked about it beforehand. People knew that she was going to do it. She realized the pain that could come to her family and to her from backlash from the white community, and she did that. So this is an incredibly brave and courageous thing that she did. It wasn't just sort of by chance. But anyway, she sat down, she wouldn't move when she was asked, and she got arrested. She again, because she had been active in civil rights issues for some time, and because she fit this model of a more quote-unquote sort of respectable, she was middle class, she had this respectable job, she had been active in the movement, the NAACP really begins to get behind her. And Rosa Parks' arrest just completely energizes the black community. Several women who had been active in these pushes against the buses, immediately, many of them were professors at Alabama State University here in Montgomery, and immediately they run to Alabama State and they begin mimeographing hundreds of little flyers to announce a boycott of the buses. They initially intended the boycott to be just for one day, on a Monday, after Rosa Parks' arrest. And so they mimeograph all of these real hurriedly, and they begin giving them out to people as they come home from work. On that Friday, they give them to the church leaders and to the people in the churches on Sunday, sort of getting the word out that they were going to boycott. And again, they just intended this to be for one day. The bus boycott that one day was really, really successful. There was no one on the buses that Monday. And so the African American community basically decided that they wanted to extend this and they wanted to keep it going. They faced some problems, though. If they were going to keep it going, they were going to need sort of some organization and some leadership. They were also going to have people who were helping black people get to work. Can't just not go to work. So two things happen. The Montgomery group formed a group called the Montgomery Improvement Association. They selected a young man named Martin Luther King as their leader. They primarily selected King. He was a newcomer to Montgomery. He had come from Atlanta. He had just been here about a year. He was the minister at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which is downtown in Montgomery. His dad was a minister as well, kind of came from a theological sort of background. But Martin Luther King was sort of new and didn't have a lot of baggage that some of the other activists had in Montgomery, and so he was sort of a clean slate. So they picked him as the face, as the leadership of this organization. in addition, so they did that. They got the organization, they got it started, they got some leadership. In addition to that, though, they're going to have to sort of figure out some ways of keeping it going and keeping the black community in their jobs. This really fell to and was organized by and led by women. So there were enormous numbers of little fundraisers. They would have fish fries. They would have, bake sales. They would have, all kinds of different things to begin to try to raise money. They began to organize carpools where some of the African Americans who did have their own car would donate the car for, the day or whatever. And the car would go around to where the bus stops were and would stop at, the regular bus stops, and would pick people up and take them to work and then, pick them up at the end of the day. In order to do that, though, you've got to have some money, right? Cars aren't free. You have to pay for the gas. You have to pay for tires. You have to pay for, if they break down. So the fundraising, quite a bit of it was going to that kind of endeavor. But they began to organize these carpools. And a lot of people just walked as well. They were doing a lot more walking than they were to stay off the buses. But it's important to understand, that bus boycott was really, really successful. And, since black people were the majority of riders and black women were the majority of those on those buses, they realized that they had a chance to really hurt the city. And the city ran them, the city funded them. If the city was not getting that money in, they knew that that would get their voice heard at least a little bit and maybe get some concessions. They were very successful again. It took over a year, and as they kept boycotting, the white people in Montgomery did not just react to this sitting down and let this happen. The white people in Montgomery responded by doing all kinds of different things. One of the things that they did was they sort of found, quote unquote, some anti-boycott laws, and began prosecuting some of the leaders of the bus boycott for violating these anti-boycott laws. They also passed laws banning carpools as a public nuisance, to try to stop the bus boycott as well. And they were arresting people who were, in the carpools and driving the cars and in the cars. So part of how the whites responded was in a legal fashion, a peaceful fashion, not a positive peaceful, but a peaceful fashion where they were passing laws to try to react and obstruct. In addition to that, though, some of the whites in Montgomery reacted violently. So other citizens responded by bombing churches and homes of some of the black leaders, including Martin Luther King's. So the black leadership and the organization came together. The bus boycott went on for over a year. They faced quite a bit from white leaders and other just white citizens. But after over a year, in November of 1956, the Supreme Court finally declared Montgomery's system of segregation on the buses illegal, and the men and women of Montgomery had won their battle. So the Montgomery bus boycott is a really good example of something during the first phase of the movement. They are protesting peacefully through things like boycotts. They are, and this was kind of very influenced by King in many ways. King had earned his PhD in theology at Boston University, and while he was working on his PhD, he had become very interested in the philosophy and tactics of Henry David Thoreau, who was a transcendentalist philosopher in the mid-1800s, and Gandhi, who was the leader of the Indian independence movement, not Native American, but Indian, from England, independence movement. And what King had gained from studying both of these men were the ideas that both of these men had talked about and developed and actually done in their lives, was the ideas of civil disobedience, in other words, breaking laws if you thought that they were unjust, nonviolence, techniques, particularly Gandhi was really a forerunner of all of that, and passive resistance. In other words, again, resisting the law, but doing so in a nonviolent way. So King was really very influential in sort of forming a philosophy of how people were going to move forward in activism. And this was very common during the civil rights movement, the first phase, where you see things like the bus boycott. And by the way, the Montgomery bus boycott was not the first bus boycott. It was just kind of the one that was the most prominent. Out of the Montgomery bus boycott, King forms an organization because he wants to keep this momentum moving and he wants to spread it on a bigger scale. He forms an organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, which is still around today. His children are involved in it still. But this was an organization that he kind of wanted to spread out to the rest of the nation. So basically we have the bus boycott, which is, we have passive resistance, nonviolent civil disobedience, where they're, sort of trying to draw attention to these laws and bring change, which was very successful. Now, of course, racists and those who favored segregation, and here's a picture of Ralph Abernathy, who is the man on the left, and of course Martin Luther King on the right, both prominent Montgomery activists at the time. Of course, the racists and those who favored segregation, we talk about the Brown decision and how it impacted the black community, particularly I mentioned the example of Montgomery, but white people in the South didn't just take that Brown decision lying down. There was a big reaction from them as well. The South, using its creativity for evil, basically, instead of good, the South really strongly resisted desegregation in a lot of different ways. So again, we're going to see this sort of pattern of legalized resistance, but then also some patterns of this extra legal violence in all of this resistance. Southerners did protest and resist Brown nonviolently. Several states formed what was called white citizens councils. These were organizations that were specifically formed to oppose school desegregation. These were at the city level, local level. Often they would have the mayor and the police chief and that kind of, those local white leaders. But their sole purpose was to oppose desegregation. They wanted to stop that. They also at a more national kind of level, so white citizens councils were pretty local. At a more national level, over 100 members of Congress signed something called the Southern Manifesto. This picture right here is of a man named Strom Thurmond. He was a longtime senator from South Carolina. His wife is helping him type, because men didn't do those kinds of things. But Strom Thurmond wrote this document called the Southern Manifesto. Over 100 members of Congress signed it, and it was opposing Brown. It was opposing the Brown decision. It called the Brown decision unconstitutional. It called for massive resistance to the decision on the part of the South, and several state legislatures signed on to this and said that they would defy the Brown decision. One of the things that scared a lot of people is that this was really starting to sound like the beginnings of the Civil War. If you study the Civil War, there was kind of this state reaction to saying that, they didn't have to follow national laws or they didn't have to follow Supreme Court decisions. So several states also really went out of their way to even cut back drastically the public school systems rather than integrate, or even to abolish their state schools. Mississippi and South Carolina abolished their public school systems. Virginia closed their school systems down. Arkansas. There were also cases where, it wasn't that kids weren't going to school, although sometimes that did happen, but schools would or systems would reopen their schools as quote-unquote private academies. which would mean basically they were white, and so they didn't have to be desegregated. So when you look across the South and see many private schools opening in 1955, 1956, the late 50s, that's not an accident. A lot of those were opening primarily because they wanted to keep white supremacy in place. There could also be violent resistance to the Brown decision. The example that I want to talk about here is with the Little Rock, Arkansas incident. So let me tell you a little bit about what was going on there. Little Rock happened in 1957. And the background for this involved President Eisenhower as well as the governor of the state of Arkansas at the time, whose name was Orville Faubus. Faubus. President Eisenhower was not really a friend to the civil rights movement. He had not liked the idea of desegregating the armed forces. President Truman had ordered that in 1948. Eisenhower was Army Chief of Staff at that point. He had not thought that was very good. But he was also really angry with the Brown decision. And he was very upset with that. He had appointed Earl Warren to be Supreme Court Chief Justice, and Warren had issued the Brown decision, but Eisenhower had been really unhappy about that. He had thought that desegregation should just happen sort of a changing people's minds and by praying about things, not through laws and not through Supreme Court decisions. So he was really upset about the Brown decision and was upset with his appointee Warren. So he wasn't real happy about this idea of having to desegregate. He is going to have to act when he's forced into acting, and sort of when the prestige and power of the presidency are at risk, which is what happens in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. Okay, so in Little Rock, the schools were segregated, and the school board had refused to desegregate on their own, and so it required a court order, and a court there ordered the Little Rock school system to bring in 9 African American students into Central High School, to desegregate Central High School. So the Central High School got an order to desegregate. The governor of the state, Orville Faubus, at the time was not about to let this happen. He was an ardent segregationalist, very strong segregationalist, and basically he called out the National Guard to ring the school, to line the school, and to prevent these 9 students, who are known as the Little Rock 9, really brave group of young people, from going to school there. A federal court told Faubus, hey, no, you can't do this. You can't defy the court order. And so Faubus was forced to withdraw the National Guard troops, but in their place, a huge white mob appeared around the school, and they were taunting and threatening the students, throwing things at them or yelling and screaming at them as they tried to come into school. Now, the thing is that you've got some pictures here. It's the Little Rock 9 on the right. The thing is here that Eisenhower could not just let this massive resistance to the law of the land, even if he didn't really like it, he couldn't just let that stand. And in addition, we are in the middle of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union is really using this issue and publicizing this issue as an example of American racism and as an example of how America does not treat its citizens equally. So Eisenhower responded by sending 1,000 Army troops, National Army troops, and 10,000 National Guardsmen to protect the students and to allow them to enter school. Now, they weren't all exactly right there at the high school, but kind of also throughout the city to make sure that, riots didn't occur and that kind of stuff. That didn't end things. And by the way, the guardsmen or the military, the soldiers were actually accompanying the students to class. The students were, really angry about this, the black students. They would accompany them into the bathroom. They just, it was a very difficult kind of situation. But anyway, they were able to get into school. The episode, though, was not over. Faust decided in reaction to what Eisenhower did, forcing this integration, to completely close down the Little Rock schools altogether. Now, again, the courts came back later and said, no, you can't do that. But the point of all this is the lengths to which many in the South would go to make sure that black and white children did not go to school together. So that, in essence, is the first phase of the civil rights movement. Main leaders were people like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. They were forming organizations like the Montgomery Improvement Association and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to do passive resistance, nonviolent kind of action. Their overall goal was desegregation, like we see in the Montgomery Bus Boycott. They faced significant resistance from whites, of course, in the form of both laws and legal resistance as well as violent resistance. So in the next part, we're going to be talking about the second phase.